I was raised in a King James-only, dispensational, independent Baptist church near Syracuse, New York. We valued singing hymns, denouncing corrupt translations of the Bible, like the NIV, placing Chick tracts in every bathroom stall and restaurant table, along with a generous tip, and more than anything else, missionaries. If memory serves, our little church supported over 50 missionaries who could be found ministering on every continent except Antarctica. When they would return home, usually to raise funds, we would host them in a single wide trailer specifically furnished for them, and invite them to speak during worship services. I can remember many a Sunday night service sitting in a darkened sanctuary, watching slides of happy faces in the Philippines or Ireland or some other nation that needed the gospel of Jesus Christ, and listening to a missionary speak of the highs and lows of missionary work. I can also remember my dad dropping a little extra money into the offering plate to help with their work. After service, he would track the missionaries down to remind them that he had been praying for them and would continue to do so. As I mentioned in the last episode, praying for missionaries was part of his daily routine. What did spreading the gospel in these foreign countries entail? For many missionaries, they had to learn the local language, a task not made easier with the passage of time. Additionally, they often couldn't be sent as missionaries, but rather as a skilled laborer of some kind, or an ESL teacher, or something similar. Fundamentally, it was all about building relationships and talking about Jesus once those relationships had been formed. While missionaries undoubtedly engaged in evangelical cold calls, their most fruitful work was found in the slow, gradual relationship building that produced not simply converts, but lifelong disciples. In the last two episodes, we've looked at the story of Paul as it is told to us in the Acts of the Apostles, a book that, among other things, describes the missionary activity of the early church. In episode 4, we reach the point in the narrative where Paul first reaches the Macedonian city of Thessalonica. Today, we will consider that initial visit from the perspective of Paul himself in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Following this, we will compare the account in Acts with what Paul suggests in his letter. Welcome to another extended episode of Amateur Exegesis. Let's begin with my translation of the passage. For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, our visit to you has not been unproductive. Rather, having faced suffering and shameful treatment in Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in great agony. For our appeal was not made from error, nor from an ulterior motive, nor with trickery. Rather, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, thus we speak, not as pleasing people, but God, the one who examines our hearts. For it was never with flattering words that we came, just as you know, nor with a pretext for greed, God is witness. Nor did we seek the praise of people, not from you or from anyone else. Though able to throw our weight around as Christ's apostles, we instead came into your midst with gentleness, as a nurse who cares for her own children. Thus caring greatly for you, we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but even our own souls, because of how beloved to us you became. For you remember, brothers and sisters, our labor and hardship. Night and day we worked so as to not burden any of you while we preached to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God, how holy and righteous and blameless to you believers we were, just as you know how with each one of you we were as a father with his own children, exhorting you and encouraging and urging that you walk worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. What Paul describes here is his first visit to the Thessalonian community, a visit that we know from chapter 1 was a success because of its effects. Here, however, Paul describes what happened from his own perspective, addressing the how of his sharing of the gospel with the Thessalonians. We catch a glimpse of not only Paul's motivations and emotions, but also his missionary strategy. The first thing that Paul does is to appeal to the knowledge that the Thessalonians had of his time spent with them. This is strategic. Paul wants to reinforce their bond, and an appeal to their shared experience accomplishes exactly that. The way Paul goes about doing this is to mention the suffering and shameful treatment he had undergone in Philippi. Paul does not explain what exactly this entailed, but the author of the Acts of the Apostles depicts a situation wherein Paul is arrested, stripped naked, beaten with rods, and then imprisoned. Regardless of what exactly happened, Paul uses this experience to not only contrast the response of the Thessalonians, but also to make the point that God had emboldened them despite what they had suffered at the hands of the Philippians. It is here that, as Abraham Mallerby shows, Paul demonstrates his indebtedness to Greco-Roman philosophical and rhetorical traditions. Paul, in verse 1, reminds the Thessalonians that his initial visit to them was not kene, unproductive. As is clear from the context, Paul connects this directly to his preaching of the gospel. He is therefore distinguishing himself from those who merely talk to entertain, uninterested in seeing their words produce some moral effect in the lives of their hearers. Such speech the handbooks on rhetoric described as empty, Mallerby writes, which reflected as much the characters of the speakers as their speeches, for they merely aimed at pleasing. Not so Paul. As we learn in verse 4, Paul spoke with the aim of pleasing God, not people, since it was God and God alone who could rightly examine his heart. He also shows his indebtedness to Greco-Roman ideas in verse 2, where he says, "We had courage in our God to speak to you the gospel." The word I have translated as "we had courage" is from a word often used in the context of Greek political philosophy to express frank and truthful speech, and later is associated with the moral philosophers' use of free speech to cure human ills. But Paul's boldness to preach is not to be found in his own person and efforts. As I mentioned in episode 4, Paul seems to be speaking of powerful deeds he performed through God's Spirit in chapter 1, verse 5. Thus, it is God who is the divine source of his courage and strength. This is why his visit was not unproductive. God was at work through him and the missionary team. At the end of verse 2, Paul refers to speaking the gospel in great agony. My translation reflects more transliteration than translation, since the word behind agony is the Greek word agony. What does Paul mean when he speaks of agony? In all likelihood, Paul has in view the idea of an athletic contest, a metaphor of which Stoics and Cynics were fond of using. As Leon Morris notes, the term denotes not a token opposition, a tepid struggle, but a very real battle. While some commentators have sought to connect this agonizing context with the story told in Acts chapter 17, the context here suggests Paul is referring to something internal. For example, the various vices listed in verse 3. Another possibility, offered by Earl Richard, is that Paul is speaking of the competitive rhetorical context in which his preaching at Thessalonica had taken place. In other words, Paul was not the only one speaking in Thessalonica, and so he faced an agonizing contest to make the gospel known to those within earshot. In verses 1 and 2, Paul used a rhetorical technique known as antithesis, a device he also used in chapter 1, verse 5. The pattern of an antithesis is simple enough. First, Paul states something negatively. For example, in verse 1, Paul writes that his visit was not unproductive. Second, Paul states something positively. In verse 2, Paul wrote that he had courage to speak the gospel. Paul continues to use antithesis in verses 3 to 8, with great effect. For our appeal was made not from error, nor from ulterior motive, nor with trickery, Paul says in verse 3. Rather, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, thus we speak, not as pleasing people, but God, the one who examines our hearts. Here, Paul begins to speak directly about his motives. In verses 3 to 4, the antithesis is straightforward. Paul was not pulling one over on the Thessalonians or deceiving them because he himself was deceived. Instead, he makes it clear that it was God himself who approved of Paul's work and entrusted him with the great task of spreading the gospel. Moreover, Paul's ministry was not about tickling the ears of his audience. In verse 2, Paul states that he had courage in God to speak, using the language of free and frank speech. As Mallarby notes, philosophers held in contempt those who wanted to entertain the crowds for personal gain. In their eyes, this was the opposite of free and frank speech. This wasn't Paul. He sought God's approval, not people's. This aversion to flattery is picked up again in verses 5 to 6, as well as the suggestion he was greedy or seeking a pat on the back from his listeners. He wasn't a flatterer? No, and the Thessalonians are witnesses to that fact. He wasn't preaching for personal gain? No, and God is his witness. Throughout this section, Paul will appeal to the Thessalonians' memory of his initial visit. They are, in the words of Margaret Mitchell, his character witnesses. Paul's defense throughout this passage isn't merely about himself. He has a nobler goal, namely, to reinforce the empathetic bond between himself and the Thessalonians. To this end, Paul employs a couple of different metaphors. First, in verse 7, Paul compares himself to a nurse who cares for her own children. The metaphor of a nurse, or trophos, is apt for Paul. Given the relatively high infant mortality rate in the first century, Monia Stubbs notes, the care provided by a nurse was essential to its existence. Historically, a nurse was one charged with the care of others' children. Undoubtedly, a good nurse provided her charges with her undivided attention. But Paul's metaphor isn't about a nurse who cares for someone else's children. Rather, Paul's metaphor is about a nurse who cares for her own children. The implicit logic here is that if a nurse is gentle and careful with another's child, then she must surely be even more so with her own. And this is how Paul behaved with the Thessalonians. The second metaphor Paul uses is found in verse 11, where he compares himself to a father with his own children. As I mentioned in episode 1, because public education was not widespread in the ancient world, it fell on the father to instruct his children on how to make their way in the world and to live right within it. In many ways, the Thessalonians had entered a brand new world, one that was rapidly approaching the end of all things, and so as their father, he, per verse 12, exhorted, encouraged, and urged them to walk worthy of God's calling. They were, after all, God's chosen ones, and it was Paul, having been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, who was ordained to the task of bringing them up in the faith. Why such imagery? Why does Paul depict himself both as a nursing mother and a dutiful father? Eugene Boring offers a succinct explanation. The intensification of family imagery in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 1 through 12 is no accident. Conversion to the Christian faith had sometimes caused strained relationships within families, or even uprooted the new converts from their family life, and they needed the reassurance that they belonged to a new and greater family. This kind of language is not merely descriptive or hortatory, but also performative. It brings into being the reality it describes. But it was not just with family members that such a strain would have been created. The implication of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 9 is that the Pauline community was not comprised of Jews, but pagans. They had turned to God from idols, Paul explains, to serve the living and true God. Such language, Pamela Eisenbaum writes, is standard language, almost cliché, to describe Gentiles who have come to appreciate the wisdom of Jewish monotheism. But Paul was not interested in turning non-Jews into Jews. In writing to Galatian believers who were being drawn in by rival Jesus followers that Paul claimed were promoting a different gospel, the apostle makes clear that if his Gentile readers undergo circumcision, and therefore become Jewish proselytes, that Christ will be of no benefit to them, and they will be obliged to obey the entire law. Paul did not want his pagan followers to become Jews. They were to remain as Gentiles. And herein lies the difficulty for these pagans. Mark Nanos explains, Paul prohibited non-Jews who turned to God in Christ from becoming Jews, yet at the same time he also instructed them not to practice one of the most basic ways of being non-Jews in the Roman world of Paul's time, namely family and civic cult. Paula Fredrickson complicates this situation further by noting that ancient people were born into their relationships with their gods. Cult was an aspect and a statement of a people's family connection, of their peoplehood, of their ethnicity. From the moment of his birth, a Thessalonian male was obligated to his ancestral gods, and so to abandon their worship put his family and even his city at risk of divine wrath. It would only make sense that his neighbors would be none too pleased with the prospect of converting. This, then, is the heart of the problem. On the one hand, Paul was preaching to non-Jews that they must abandon their families' and cities' cults to worship exclusively the God of Israel. To their pagan neighbors, this would make them appear to be Jewish. On the other hand, Paul makes it clear that they are not Jews, as they were not to take the sign of the covenant, circumcision. So, to Jews, they are pagans. To pagans, they are Jews. In reality, they are neither. The early apostles, writes Fredrickson, walked these Christ-fearing pagans into a social and religious no-man's land. Paul's Thessalonian community, therefore, was comprised of people who had no people, veritable orphans in a world where family was fundamental. Into this void, this social and religious no man's land of which Fredrickson wrote, he interjects images of a family, one where God is their father, and Paul too takes on parental imagery as a nursing mother and a father, reinforcing the sense of family solidarity among the readers and depicting a nurturing ministry of pastoral care. In verses 8 through 10, Paul seeks to further demonstrate his affection for the Thessalonians. First, he says that he shared with them not only the gospel, but also his very soul, due to the affection he felt for them. Coupled with both the nursing mother imagery of verse 7 and that of a dutiful father in verses 11 through 12, Paul's affectionate language intensifies the emotional tone of the discussion. Paul's missionary activity was not like a traveling salesman who is in and out quickly, disconnected from the day-to-day lives of those to whom he is making his pitch. Rather, for Paul, the work of spreading the gospel was a total investment. It's why, when we read Paul's letters, we can detect powerful emotions. In the letter to the Galatians, for example, you can detect Paul's frustration and anger with both the Judaizing Jesus followers seeking to lead the Gentile Galatians astray, as well as the Galatians' apparent willingness to go along with it. Here in 1 Thessalonians, readers can detect Paul's love for the Thessalonians and the warmth with which he wrote. Verse 9 is pivotal for understanding the context of Paul's kerygma, or preaching. Though Acts depicts Paul as a powerful speaker, one who confidently proclaimed Jesus as the crucified and resurrected Messiah in Jewish synagogues, and even entered the philosophical lion's den in Athens, Paul depicts himself as one not particularly eloquent. "My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom," he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, "but with the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God." Others, too, had observed Paul's ineloquence. "His letters are weighty and strong," someone said of Paul, "but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible." Paul was neither a great orator nor what we might call a street preacher, writes J. Albert Harrell. Instead, he seems to have spoken about Jesus while he did manual labor. Just what exactly this labor entailed isn't clear, though on the evidence of the book of Acts we could plausibly posit that Paul was a tent maker. Manual labor was often looked down upon, and it is likely that Paul was viewed as a member of one of the lower social classes. However, in terms of his missionary strategy, working as a manual laborer was pure genius. Harrell explains. Such a setting would have exposed Paul to a wide socio-economic mix of people. Ancient workshops were family businesses that connected visitors of the larger network of household relationships in an urban neighborhood. They employed both slave and free labor side by side. Their proprietors were not typically members of the aristocratic elite, but rather artisans themselves. The patronage and slaveholding that grew businesses also interconnected the rich and the poor economically, tempering what we might call class distinctions. Moreover, manual laborers were often subjected to abuse and humiliation, things that Paul claims to have experienced himself in his ministry. In these ways, then, Paul demonstrates a sort of solidarity with those to whom he is offering the gospel. He's just like they are, giving credibility to the message he offers them about the God of Israel and his crucified and resurrected Son. Additionally, as verse 9 tells us, Paul's decision to support himself through work as an artisan was intended to avoid burdening those hearing him. Calvin Rotzel suggests that this was for Paul a way for him to avoid compromising both his independence and the gospel he preached. In this way, verse 10 reports, the Thessalonians witnessed Paul's holiness, righteousness, and blamelessness while he was there with them. In episodes 3 and 4, we briefly looked at the depiction of Paul in Acts, and we traced his narrative from the death of Stephen in Acts chapter 7 to the initial visit to Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17. We've also, in the past 4 episodes, gone over 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 12. So, with all this covered, what can we say about the depiction of Paul in Acts versus what we find in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians? To begin with, whatever value the Acts of the Apostles has in reconstructing the life of Paul and the foundation of the Thessalonian community of Jesus followers, it must be conceded by all that the book of Acts is not a primary source for these topics. Rather, it is at best a secondary source. But why should we consider the book of Acts to be at best a secondary source for these issues? There are a variety of reasons. First and foremost, since primary sources consist of the written material produced more or less contemporaneously with the object of research, ideally recorded by eyewitnesses, the book of Acts cannot function as such. While tradition ascribes the authorship of both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles to an individual named Luke, a known associate of Paul from his letter to Philemon, in reality, both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, though almost certainly written by the same author, are anonymous. Moreover, their singular author was undoubtedly an educated follower of the Apostle Paul. But it is almost certainly not the case that their author was a contemporary of Paul. In terms of the order in which the 2 volumes of Luke and Acts were written, the Gospel of Luke undoubtedly has priority. This is all but demanded by the logic of the preface to the Acts of the Apostles, found in Acts chapter 1 verses 1 through 5. There is mention of the first book, suggesting that Acts is the second. Theophilus is mentioned by name as he was in Luke chapter 1 verse 3, and the preface in Acts summarizes in broad strokes the entirety of the Gospel of Luke, particularly the final chapter. But the Gospel of Luke is not a wholly original creation. Instead, scholars are reasonably certain that the author used the Gospel of Mark when writing his own, incorporating around 70% of Mark's material. There is also evidence to suggest that the author of the Gospel of Luke not only used the Gospel of Mark, but also the Gospel of Matthew, a narrative about Jesus that also used Mark's Gospel. So then, the dating of the Acts of the Apostles is dependent upon the dating of the Gospel of Luke, and the dating of the Gospel of Luke is dependent upon the dating of both the Gospel of Mark, the first of the canonical Gospels to have been written, as well as the Gospel of Matthew. In chronological order, then, first came Mark, then came Matthew, then came Luke, and then came Acts. When was Mark's Gospel written? We do not have the time to go into depth on the dating of Mark in this episode or even this season of Amateur Exegesis, but we can state the scholarly consensus. The Gospel of Mark was written sometime just before or just after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Let's assume that Mark wrote in 70. When did Matthew write? It must have necessarily been sometime after Mark produced his account, especially when one considers that the invention of the printing press didn't happen until 1400 years after these authors composed their respective volumes. Moreover, the author of the Gospel of Matthew undoubtedly wrote after 70 CE, given the way he has Jesus interact with the Pharisees, referring to them in rather harsh ways. Whenever he refers to scribes and Pharisees, Keith Nicol writes, he also has the Judaism of his own day in mind. In the wake of the fall of the temple, it was the Pharisees who became the leading sect of Judaism, giving the Jewish people a new center of religious life apart from the temple. Some scholars think, then, that the Matthean community was one that was in conflict with the Pharisaic movement and struggling to define itself, not as an entirely new religion outside of Judaism, but as a sect within it. We may thus think of it as sibling rivalry, L. Michael White writes, in which the followers of Jesus are now feeling marginalized by their Jewish neighbors. What does this mean for dating the Gospel of Matthew? For starters, it is clearly post-70 CE, but also post the Gospel of Mark. It is not unreasonable to think that at least a decade passed before a copy of Mark's Gospel could have been produced, placed in circulation, and made its way to the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Thus, it seems that if Mark wrote his Gospel in 70 CE, Matthew wrote his in 80 CE. New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman dates the writing of the Gospel of Matthew to somewhere between 80 to 85 CE. Other scholars favor slightly later dates, ranging from 85 to 100 CE. For the purposes of this episode, let's assume 80 CE. Mark writes in 70 and Matthew in 80. If Luke uses both Mark and Matthew, when did he write his Gospel? When dating any ancient source, there are two expressions that scholars use. The first is terminus a quo, a Latin phrase that means limit from which. In short, terminus a quo refers to the earliest possible time at which an event occurred, or in our case, in which a document was written. For the book of Acts, the terminus a quo is whatever date the Gospel of Luke was published, since, as I noted earlier, the two documents are related to one another. The terminus for the Gospel of Luke is dependent upon the date of the Gospel of Matthew, which, in turn, is dependent upon the Gospel of Mark. If we assumed that Mark wrote his Gospel on August 31st of 70 CE, the day after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, then it's possible that Matthew wrote his on September 1st and Luke on September 2nd. But possibility is not plausibility, and we may reject this scheme on historical grounds. As I stated earlier, it undoubtedly took time for a gospel to be published, and then sufficiently circulated so it could be redacted. So, if Mark is 70, Matthew 80, then Luke is 90. The terminus a quo for the Acts of the Apostles, then, would not be long after that. But that merely establishes the earliest possible date, not the likeliest one. The second expression scholars use in dating works of antiquity is terminus ad quem, another Latin phrase that means limit up to which. This refers to the latest possible date an event occurred, or in our case, in which a document was composed. The key question in determining the terminus ad quem is, what is the earliest external reference to a given document? This is a relatively easy question to answer in the case of the Acts of the Apostles, the 2nd century. Is it possible to be more precise? The clearest reference to it comes from the pen of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century. In Book 3 of Against Heresies, the Bishop of Lyon discussed Paul's itinerary relative to the Council of Jerusalem, quoting from Paul's letter to the Galatians. He concludes by writing, "If then anyone shall, from the Acts of the Apostles, carefully scrutinize the time concerning which it is written that he went up to Jerusalem, he will find those years mentioned by Paul coincided with it. Thus the statement of Paul harmonizes with, and is, as it were, identical with, the testimony of Luke regarding the Apostles." In his commentary on Acts, Hans Conzelmann lists a variety of early possible reminiscences of Acts, including many found in the Apostolic Fathers, like 1 Clement and Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. But, he notes, the phrases and expressions used in these texts that are similar to those found in Acts were common to the language of early Christianity, an indication not necessary of literary dependence, but of shared tradition. Time does not permit a full discussion of these issues, and there's debate over whether other authors before Irenaeus, but after the Apostolic Fathers, like Justin Martyr, knew the Acts of the Apostles. However, no one debates that the clearest and most explicit reference to the book of Acts comes from Irenaeus. Thus, the terminus ad quem is around 180 CE. But, as with the terminus a quo, this only tells us the latest possible date Acts could have been written, not the likeliest one. Our chronological bookends, then, for the writing of the Acts of the Apostles are 90 CE and 180 CE. Can anything more be said about the dating of Acts? One of the more interesting arguments to come out of the scholarship of the 19th century was that the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles had utilized the works of the first-century Jewish historian Josephus. One of the best modern treatments of the issue is Steve Mason's Josephus and the New Testament. In Chapter 6 of that volume, Mason discusses the relationship of Luke Acts with that of Josephus. First, he mentions generic parallels, like the similarities to be found in the prefaces of both the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, and that of Josephus's Jewish War. Such similarities, he observes, are no doubt due to their use of the conventional tools of Hellenistic historiography. Second, Mason moves on to commonly reported events, like the census in Syria that happened when Quirinius was governor. Mention of this event, and others, suggest a closer relationship between the two, such that, Mason writes, these observations suggest that Luke was familiar with Josephus's work. Third, Mason addresses what he sees as agreements of theme and vocabulary between Luke Acts and Josephus, like their shared language of philosophical schools for Jewish sects, their criticisms of wealth and power, and more. Mason concludes the chapter by writing, If Luke did know Josephus, then we can fix the date of Luke in the mid-90s or later, for Josephus finished the Antiquities, the major work in question, in 93. Luke may have heard an earlier version or only a part of the work recited, perhaps in 90 or so. But a date of 95 or later for Luke would seem most plausible if he knew Antiquities 18 to 20. Barbara Schellert, in her monograph, New Light on Luke, reasons similarly, asserting that it seems more than likely Luke used Jewish war, quite likely he used Jewish antiquities, and possible that he used against Apion. Consequently, for Schellert, a date of around 100 CE seems fitting. Neither Mason nor Schellert are alone in their assessment, and other scholars have looked at a number of people, places, and events that can be found in the Lucan texts and Josephus that make it likely the author of Luke Acts knew Josephus's work, consequently placing the terminus a quo for Acts into the mid-90s. This coheres with what I said a short while ago on the topic based upon the relationship of the Acts of the Apostles to the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of Luke's relationship to the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. If the author used Josephus, especially Jewish antiquities, a date of 95 CE for the composition of the book of Acts is not unreasonable. If anything, it may be too early. The reason I said that it may be too early has to do with one of the perennial debates in New Testament studies. The problem is this: all of Paul's letters were occasional. That is, they were written to specific audiences, under specific circumstances, for specific purposes. Had the letter to the Galatians ended up in the hands of the Thessalonians, there might have been some confusion. What was this different gospel that wasn't really a gospel? Why would these ex-pagans want to become Jewish proselytes via circumcision? Because the struggles specific to the Galatian communities would not necessarily map onto those of the Thessalonians, confusion would ensue had their mail gotten mixed up. And yet, the New Testament contains multiple letters by Paul to various communities. How did this happen? And more importantly, when did it happen? To answer the first question would require more time than we have. Interested listeners should read Stanley Porter's summary of the various theories on how Paul's letters came to be collected in the volume Paul in the Second Century. For now, let me say some general things about the when of the creation of the Pauline corpus. The first signs of a collection of Paul's letters comes from the Epistle of 1 Clement, which was written sometime toward the end of the 1st century CE. There in chapter 47, the author tells his Corinthian audience, "Take up the epistle of the blessed Paul the Apostle. What did he first write to you in the beginning of the gospel? Truly, he wrote to you in the Spirit about himself and Cephas and Apollos, because even then you had split into factions." The text to which he is referring is found in what we know as the first epistle of Paul to the Corinthians. There are also signs that the author of 1 Clement knew the Pauline epistle to the Romans, but beyond these Pauline epistles, there's no concrete data. It doesn't seem that the author knew Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, since, as Ian Elmer observes, the content of 2 Corinthians would have served his argument better. Regardless, as Elmer notes, The significance of 1 Clement lies not so much in the number of letters that it referred to, as in the fact that this letter, from the Roman Church to the Corinthian Church, reflects an acquaintance with two letters that are unrelated geographically. So, a corpus of Paul's letters seems to have existed in the 90s CE, but was relatively small. Others among the Apostolic Fathers also knew of a collection of Paul's letters. The Bishop Ignatius, for example, shows signs that he knew many of Paul's letters. According to Eusebius, Ignatius died sometime during the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, martyred for his faith in Jesus Christ. In the few weeks before his death, while imprisoned in Rome, Ignatius wrote 7 letters to various communities, including to those in Ephesus, Rome, and Philadelphia. In these 7 letters, he demonstrates knowledge of the epistles of Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, and Philippians. So, at least in the East, in Antioch, where Ignatius served as bishop, a collection of Paul's letters seems to have been known that was larger than what was found in the West in Rome, where the author of 1 Clement had been writing. Thus, it seems that around 100 CE, that a collection of Paul's letters was growing. What does all of this have to do with the Acts of the Apostles? In a word, much. The Acts of the Apostles, writes Gerd Thiessen, appears at first glance to be unfamiliar with any letters of Paul, who is nowhere described as a letter writer. For some conservative scholars, this supposed silence is suggestive of an early date for the writing of the book of Acts, perhaps around 62 CE. But is the book of Acts devoid of any knowledge of the Pauline letters? Some scholars don't think that it is. For example, in an article published half a century ago, historian Morten Enslin listed 11 places where he believed that Luke not only did know, but made occasional use of at least some of Paul's letters. For example, in Luke chapter 24, verse 34, the 2 disciples that had walked with the risen Jesus on the way to Emmaus report to the 11, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Astute readers of Luke's Gospel know that no such appearance to Simon is narrated. So, where did this exclamation come from? For Enslin, the answer is clear. He got it from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5. He appeared to Cephas. So the author of the Gospel of Luke, and by extension the Acts of the Apostles, appears to have known Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Enslin makes the case that the author of Luke Acts knew other Pauline epistles as well, including Romans, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Philippians. 15 years after Enslin published his article, William O. Walker, Jr. did a follow-up entitled Acts and the Pauline Corpus Reconsidered, in which he generally affirmed Enslin's work and offered further evidence for the connection, including verbal parallels. More recent scholarship has suggested that there are around 90 texts from the book of Acts that have some affinity with texts from the epistles of Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. All of this suggests that among the author of Acts' various sources were the Pauline epistles, if not in written form, then certainly in memory. When was the Acts of the Apostles written? Based upon this information, it seems likely that it was written no earlier than 100 CE, the time frame suggested by Barbara Schellert, though Michael Parsons thinks it was probably written around 110 CE. Other scholars date the book of Acts even later, some as late as the mid-2nd century. But why does this matter? Because if Paul died in the 60s, as tradition holds, then the writing of Acts took place a generation after his death. Its author was not an eyewitness to any of the events described. Rather, the book of Acts is something of an interpretation of Paul, and is therefore, at best, a secondary source. We must therefore agree with Paula Fredrickson, who writes, "In our quest for the historical apostle, Paul's own letters must have priority." The priority of Paul's letters over the Acts of the Apostles isn't because Paul is unbiased. He most certainly is. Rather, our preference for Paul's letters is due to the fact that if we want to figure out what Paul thought and how Paul viewed his missionary activity, his own words are indispensable. But with that being said, are there places where the letters of Paul are incongruous with the Acts of the Apostles? Indeed, there are. Consider how Paul is depicted prior to his experience of Jesus on the road to Damascus. He stands in approval of Stephen's murder in Acts chapter 7, overseeing it as an authority figure. In Acts chapter 8, he conducts house raids to find and arrest Christians in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 9, with the permission of the high priest, he leaves for a city of the diaspora in which to find and arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 22, Paul describes himself as one who persecuted Christians up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison. And in Acts chapter 26, he says to Herod Agrippa, "I not only locked up many of the saints in prison, but I also cast my vote against them when they were being condemned to death." Paul is portrayed by the author of Acts as a ruthless, murderous foe of Christianity. But there are a couple of problems with this depiction. The first problem is historical. While the high priest had authority in Jerusalem to rein in wayward Jews through punishment, there's no reason to think that his authority extended beyond Jerusalem and into the diaspora, such that he could have Jews extradited and returned to Jerusalem. Moreover, as Calvin Rotzel points out, neither the high priest nor the Sanhedrin had the authority to administer capital punishment in Paul's lifetime. The author of Acts has invented all of this. In fact, the strongest physical punishment that synagogues could administer was 39 lashes, especially in cities outside of Judea. The second problem concerns Paul's own claims in his letters. Whereas the book of Acts depicts Paul's reign of terror as occurring primarily in Jerusalem, in his letter to the Galatians, Paul seems to suggest he was working in Damascus. Additionally, Paul never describes himself as one who killed members of the church, though Galatians chapter 1 verse 13 in the NRSV has Paul violently persecuting the church of God. This translation is almost certainly incorrect. Rather, as Paula Fredrickson writes, a better translation would be something like persecuting to the maximum, a reference to the 39 lashes that represented the strongest punishment a synagogue could give. Alternatively, Mark Nano suggests that it isn't physical persecution that is in view, but rather social. That is, Paul was attempting to discredit these groups using rhetoric, and if that failed, by using ostracism. Regardless, there is no reason to think that Paul was seeking to kill anyone. Additionally, While the Paul of Acts seems to depict himself as a member of the Sanhedrin, Paul, in his own letters, never makes that suggestion, despite boasting about his Jewish credentials in places like Galatians chapter 1 verses 13 to 14 and Philippians chapter 3 verses 4 to 6. Another problem arises with the story of Paul's conversion. Before his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul's efforts in stamping out the church were concentrated in Jerusalem. When he reaches Damascus and meets Jesus, he is said to have spent several days there with believers in Damascus. According to Acts chapter 9 verse 23, Paul flees the city in the wake of a conspiracy to kill him, and immediately goes to Jerusalem and meets with the apostles. But this isn't what Paul says happened in his letter to the Galatians. Paul emphatically denies going to Jerusalem after he was called by God, traveling instead to Arabia before returning to Damascus. He writes, "Then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you, before God I do not lie." So, who is right? Paul or the author of Acts? In this instance, it's hard to be certain. They can't both be right, but they could both be wrong. Paul's version of events in Galatians chapter 1 is motivated by a concern for his own authority. He wants to demonstrate that the gospel he received had nothing to do with the apostles in Jerusalem, and additionally, when he did meet the apostles at the conference in Jerusalem, they confirmed that he was preaching the true gospel. Luke, on the other hand, wants to connect Paul intimately with the apostles in Jerusalem so as to present a unified front, and that Paul's authority is derived from the apostles themselves. Whatever the case may be, these two versions of events are incongruent. To close this episode, let's consider specifically the story of the Thessalonian mission in Acts and how it compares with Paul's depiction in 1 Thessalonians. Following the work of Ernest Best, Earl Richard lists 5 areas in which the two accounts fail to cohere. First, while the narrative of Acts suggests only a stay of about 3 Sabbaths, Paul seems to imply a much longer one, claiming in Philippians chapter 4 verse 16 that while he was in Thessalonica, he had received help from the Philippians more than once. Second, whereas Acts depicts the converts in Thessalonica as including both Jews and pagans, the community to which Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians is made up exclusively of ex-pagans. Third, there seems to be a difference between Paul's preaching in Thessalonica and Acts, and what he seems to have preached per his letter. In Acts, the emphasis is on Jesus as dead and raised, with no mention of his parousia. In 1 Thessalonians, however, there is a heavy eschatological emphasis, which pervades the epistle such that it seems to serve as the best hermeneutical key with which to understand Paul's pattern of exhortation to the Thessalonians. Fourth, the prescript of 1 Thessalonians includes Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, and Timothy plays an important role as Paul's envoy in chapter 3. However, the author of Acts fails to mention Timothy at all in connection with the founding mission. Moreover, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 verses 1 through 2, Paul implies that he, Silvanus, and Timothy were in Athens, and from there sent Timothy back to Thessalonica. The book of Acts depicts the situation differently. First, Paul and Silas go to Berea. Next, Paul leaves Silas and Timothy behind in Berea and heads to Athens. Finally, Paul leaves Athens for Corinth, and it is there that Silas and Timothy arrive to meet him, not from Athens, but from Macedonia. Fifth, Acts in no way suggests that the Thessalonians were eager for Paul's return, while in 1 Thessalonians, per the report from Timothy to Paul, they were very eager to see Paul once again. We can expand on these some. In the passage we discussed today, Paul claimed to have not taken anything from the Thessalonians, choosing instead to work night and day. It was in that context, from his workshop, that Paul proclaimed the gospel of God. There is no mention of preaching in a synagogue in 1 Thessalonians, just as there is no mention of setting up a shop in the city in the book of Acts. We should also note that the image of Paul as going into the synagogue almost everywhere he went is problematic for a couple of different reasons. With regards to Thessalonica itself, as Eugene Boring writes, the narrative of Acts constitutes the only explicit literary evidence for Jewish residents of Thessalonica in Paul's time. There is, as of yet, no archaeological evidence for a synagogue in Thessalonica in the 50s CE. With regards to the general picture of Paul's ministry in Acts, the idea that he first visited the local synagogue is part of the scheme of Acts, whereby the author pays homage to the Pauline cliché, to the Jews first, and also to the Greek. Moreover, in its depiction of Jewish rejection of the gospel and pagan acceptance of it, the author of Acts not only tries to account for why the church of his day is predominantly non-Jewish, but he also wishes to show that this originally Jewish sect is in no way a threat to Rome. In fact, according to the book of Acts, its leading proponent, Paul, was a Roman citizen. While there are points of convergence between the story told in Acts and the version of events found in Paul's letters, for many details there are also many points of disagreement. This is seen in the depiction of Paul's mission to Thessalonica by the author of Acts, a portrayal that fits his concerns, but is in many ways disconnected from what Paul himself seems to be saying. For reconstructing the historical Paul, we must, as Fredrickson advised, consult Paul himself in his letters. But this introduces a new issue. Which letters? In the next episode, we will briefly explore the subject of interpolations, as well as which Pauline letters scholars generally agree were written by Paul and which ones weren't. That's next time on Amateur Exegesis.